is a privilege for me to be here. So thank you very much for inviting us here and create a possibility to speak to such a wonderful audience. My presentation will be divided into 4 parts. Firstly, I would like to speak about some arguments raised by political philosophers around posthumanism and transhumanism. Firstly, I would like to speak about equality. Then I will move to dignity as a problem, equal dignity as a problem for political philosophers such as Fukuyama especially, but also for Jürgen Habermas. And finally, I will move to autonomy, especially raised by Habermas as a problem connected to transhumanism and posthumanism. And then I will move to the final part of the presentation and an argument which will be raised by me about ecology. So let's begin. The past 50 years have been a period of intense development of biological sciences, with mapping of the human genome and great advances both in treatment of human disease and in augmentation of human capacities. Posthumanist postulates that the human body may be, or even should be, improved up to the limits of what is technologically possible. It is generally thought, however, that the decision of whether to use such therapies should be an individual matter. Some question the first postulate about the use of technology, but the second postulate of individual competence to improve one's own body might also usefully be called into the question. Let me quote what you know, but let me quote once again the Declaration of Transhumanism. It says that we favor allowing individuals wide personal choice over how they enable their lives. This includes use of techniques that may be developed to assist memory, concentration, and mental energy, life extension therapies, reproductive choice technologies, cryonics procedures, and many other possible human modification and enhancement technologies. Transhumanists also claim that their project of human improvement is directed to equality, which can only be achieved by freeing people from limitations imposed on them by the body. Science and technology, supported by the free market, are to provide the tools of the human right to be improved. Free market orientation is also connected with a question about the availability of such self-improvement. But treating the body and life as individual property open to any kind of intervention and improvement also creates many risks. Consider for a moment a conflict between individual rights and shared good. Individually used drugs, traces of which can later get into the water and cause its contamination. As a result of such contamination, water may become unfit for drinking, which limits the rights of other people to use of clean water. The individual right to take drugs, in this case, conflicts with the shared good of access to clean water. And then I would like to move to the historical framework of that presentation. In classical interpretation, life belongs to God, and each person has right and obligation to defend himself because his life is not his property. The formulation of such a relation to life is found in St. Thomas Aquinas, who uses the concept of essence and existence to justify the theological concept of human being. In his opinion, it is necessary to distinguish the essence that is, what the given thing is, from the existence or the fact that it exists in these specific circumstances. The only exception is God, who is existence itself. It being attracts existence. God is a necessary being because he has to exist. God is independent because he exists because of his own nature. And God is simply without any components. On the other hand, things are created as contingent beings, dependent on God, and they are complex. They are somehow endowed by God's existence. Every person is endowed with life. Because of it, no man is allowed to deprive himself of life, and life is treated as a gift. And this is a classical formulation of relation between life and ownership, the life as the ownership of the God. The liberal philosophy of John Locke begins the process of privatisation of life and body. Locke is regarded as one of the most influential of Enlightenment thinkers, and he is known as the father of classical liberalism. He also combines life treated as a gift, which is needed for him to formulate arguments for dignity and equality, with life and body understood as private property. The second formulation allows Locke to build an argument for autonomy. So he is the beginner, and that's the reason why I am going back to Locke, because he begins with the formulation, the ideals of equality, dignity, and autonomy. In my opinion, of course, we can look for another inspiration, but maybe he is the most important. As a human beings created by the same God, all people are equal and have special dignity. I quote Locke. In the state of perfect equality, where naturally there is no superiority or jurisdiction one over another. And the second quote, every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state the nature, had provided and left, and he had mixed his labor with, and joined to something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. These are apparently contradictory claims. Man is simultaneously absolute lord over property and absolute servant of the God. God possesses the life of the people. People possesses bodies, land, and all material goods. It brings Locke to a conviction that human action has the special character because of its creativity, similar to creativity of the God. In this way, John Locke formulates arguments later raised by other modern thinkers such as Immanuel Kant and eventually John Rawls, arguing for the equality, dignity of persons and their autonomy. Contemporary transhumanists too argue for far-reaching interference in human bodies using arguments relating to equality, dignity, and autonomy. But at the same time, political philosophers such as Francis Fukuyama, Jürgen Habermas, and Michael Sandel point out, as a part of bioethical consideration, risk associated with technological interference in the shape of our own species. They warn against treating humans as a product. They look for the political consequences of individual choices and point out that interference in human body may weaken the three core values of modernity: equality, dignity, and autonomy. Their arguments refer to the ideal of liberal democracy and its threats. I would like to add to these arguments one more, unrelating to liberal democracy and referring to life understood as a common good. So let's move to the first argument. Firstly, biotechnologies may reduce equality between persons because of the improvement of only some select individuals. Francis Fukuyama warns that the growing role of biotechnology threatens human nature. I quote Fukuyama, "Together with religion, it, human nature, defines our basic values. Human nature shapes and limits all kinds of political systems. So technology capable of changing us can have sinister consequences for both liberal democracy and the very essence of politics." Transhumanism becomes for Fukuyama the most dangerous idea of the modern world, which is no longer just a dream of science fiction supporters, but developing the post-human vision with the use of available biotechnology in effects with its utopia in which equality may be the first victim of transhumanism. The presence of technology that enables genetic modification of people can lead, according to Fukuyama at least, either to gradual racial segregation or to universal democratic eugenics. His attention is primarily drawn to the threat to equality. He points out that the ideal of equality is founded on the concept of common human nature. Already today, there is the possibility of pre-implantation diagnostic genetics, which allows future parents to examine a group of previously fertilized embryos in terms of the risk of specific diseases, and implant only those who are not at risk of them. Fukuyama points to political dangers associated with such activities. The first of these is the danger of society losing its egalitarian character in favor of an elitism of genes. Since such treatments are expensive within a few generations, in his opinion, a distinction may be made between rich and healthy, and poor and sick. Even if national institutions introduce restrictions, scientists financed by international for-profit and non-profit corporations may move to other countries. The fact is, however, that in his understanding, protection should be started at the national level. Then, through traditional methods of diplomacy, these lands should try to gain an international consensus on these issues. I quote Fukuyama. What should we do in response to biotechnology that in the future will mix great potential benefits with threats that are either cyclical or obvious or spiritual and subtle? The answer is obvious. We should use the power of the state to regulate it. And if this proves to be beyond the power of any individual nation state to regulate, it needs to be regulated on an international basis. So Fukuyama advocates the principle of the presumption of harm. It is a principle that can be applied in a political way in relation to research on such delicate issues that can potentially disturb the equality between members of the human species. And also Jürgen Habermas shows the threat of it to human equality and its moral and political consequences, saying, I am quoting Habermas, "Will we still be able to come to a self-understanding as a persons who are undivided authors of their own lives and approaches others without exceptions as a person of equal birth?" Okay, so let's move to a second point. The second point is risk of violating dignity. Biotechnologies treat human life as a product in a market economy, not as a source of dignity. This is an argument raised both by Habermas and Fukuyama, but I will show it, put special attention to Fukuyama. There is a natural equality of people that forms the basis of moral behavior toward each other. For Fukuyama and Habermas, it is dignity. While for one who believes in God, the act of divine creation is the source of dignity, for Fukuyama and Habermas, just as for Kant, dignity comes from the human ability to make moral choices. Plato uses the concept of thymos to describe the courageous part of the soul, sometimes translated as the spirited part. But what is important for us is that this part of the soul seeks recognition from other persons. Fukuyama, taking over these Platonic concepts, give it a scope which it did not have in its original context. In his view, thymos is a source of dignity. Liberal democracy is fulfilled in equal recognition or in recognition of the equal dignity of persons. I quote Fukuyama. The struggle for recognition is a concept as old as political philosophy and refers to a phenomenon coterminous with political life itself. Yet the struggle for recognition is evident everywhere around us and underlies contemporary movements for liberal rights, whether in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, Southern Africa, Asia, Latin America, or in United States itself. In his opinion, liberal democracy is a proper order, political order, because it's fulfilled in equal recognition or in recognition of the equal dignity of person. The consequence, in defense of human dignity, it is forbidden to allow the emergence of technology that will make it possible to breed people according to a scientific plan and make that fight for recognition easier for one and harder for another. Francis Fukuyama points to the possibility of breeding new genetically distinct castes. Such genetic inequality would cause social tension. It would also be possible for state programs of genetic improvement of the entire population, which would lead to differences in the international arena. Rejection of the concept of human dignity, said to belong to the human species as a feature of each individual, causes man to be a product that can be improved and programmed to order. He ceases to be an individual who requires special treatment, with orders, as it were, to treat other people in a special way. Francis Fukuyama claims that the basis for this special treatment is the shared biological heritage. He wants to defend our complex evolutionary nature from the attempts of modifications made by us. He wants to defend human dignity not only in philosophical treatises, but also through institutions, including the law prohibiting interference in the genetic endowment of the human species. And now we may move to the next part. So, risk violating autonomy. I will present it generally showing that argument in Habermas way. Biotechnologies may affect personal autonomy of some individuals because of decisions to enhance or not enhance made by their parents before they, as children, could choose for themselves. Decoding the human genome opens the possibility of interference. According to Habermas, both secular thought of European modernity and religious faith assumed that the genetic conditioning of the newborn child, defining the physiological background of his later biography, is not subject to manipulation and the will of other people. If genetic compensation were treated as something that could be disposed of, it would give parents a power that they never had before. The moment when one person makes irreversible decisions about the physiological conditions of the life of another person, a previously unknown interpersonal relationship arises. In this new relation, equal dignity disappears, and the element of domination becomes visible, which takes the form of intergenerational dominance of actively interfering in physiology. Habermas proposes the establishment of a boundary between therapeutic interventions aimed in restoring physiological standards and improving or enhancing intervention. Genetic manipulation concerns the species identity. The self-knowledge of a human being, for him, as a creature belonging to a particular species, influences our moral and legal convictions. But apart from such a general issue, in the case of interference in a genetic compensation, the scope of individual autonomy that arises as a result of such interference is less than the scope of individuals' autonomy, which grants the right to plot the futures of future offspring. The subject of the ordinance becomes the physical base which we are by nature. Habermas points out that this is a violation of Kant's categorical imperative, which requires the person always to be treated as a goal, while the relationship of domination leads to reification. I'm quoting Habermas: "The irreversible choice a person makes for desired makeup of the genome of another person initiate a type of relationship between those two which jeopardize a precondition for the moral self-understanding of autonomous actors. The threat arises that the embryo will have to meet expectation as to the number of qualities it has, so that parents want to buy it. It takes the form of present power over future ones. Influencing the genome composition is fundamentally different from the impact of a young person biography. The biographical dimension is subordinated to the rule of autonomy, although no one can deny that external influences are important. However, the individual may respond to these influences, consent can be expressed, or a decision can be rebelled against. Genetic changes, however, do not leave room for such a response. And here we have the quote: "Our concern with programming here is not whether it will restrict another person's ethical freedom and capacity of being himself, but whether and how it may eventually preclude a symmetrical relationship between the programmer and the product thus designed." And I would like to add to these arguments showing possible political consequences of posthumanism, another not so strictly connected with liberal democracy vision. It will be argument referring to I will refer to classical vision of the relationship of man to nature, which is also invoked today. In classical Greek philosophy, let's move to the next part. In classical Greek philosophy, there was not a one word to describe all of life. Zoe meant animal life, occurs only in singular. Bios meant human life, a certain way of life, individual or a group. Zoe meant the fact of belonging to a set of animated entities and was immortal and eternal. Eternal Zoe is also known as a theory that the existence of life itself and energy has been reoccurring in different forms and will continue to recur. It is a form of eternal reoccurrence theory. In nature, there is no birth and no death in our understanding. Giorgio Agamben put special attention to that division, and that we have the quote from Giorgio Agamben, Homo sacer. The Greek had no single term to express what we meant by the word life. They used two terms that, although traceable to a common etymological root, are semantically and morphologically distinct. Zoe, which expressed the simple fact of living common to all living beings, animals, men, or gods. And bios, which indicated the form of way of living proper to an individual or a group. As Hannah Arendt notes, the natural world is repetitive. It is a life that only takes the different forms of specific species. The birth and death of human beings are for us, only on the one hand, ordinary natural events, because they are accompanied by a series of the same rules that apply to every other biological entity, a more or less organized life form. On the other, persons are unique individuals. They not only have life in a biological sense, zoe, but also life in socio-historical sense, bios, thanks to which we can say that they have their biographies. I'm quoting Hannah Arendt. Men are the mortals, the only mortal things in existence, because unlike animals, they do not exist only as members of a species whose immortal life is guaranteed through procreation. The mortality of man lies in the fact that individual life with a recognizable life story from birth to death rises out of biological life. This individual life is distinguished from all other things by rectangular course of its movement, which, so to speak, cuts through the circular movement of biological life. Bios is pointed to a specific form of life, of an individual, of a group. It takes various forms, and its changes in time lead to an individual biography. In antiquity, this human form of existence was associated with politics. And Aristotle defined a man as zoon politikon. In his definition, politics is differentia specifica, which shows what distinguishes human life from the natural world. The fact that human life always occurs in a specific politically shaped form. Politics was a common zoe of each individual bios. In Greek polis, the preservation of physiological life was a citizen private concern, realized in the field of oikos, home. And real human political life took place in a public space. In modern times, the content of politics has become the physiological life itself. Ensuring basic needs is done through the states, and politics takes on the form of biopolitics. Modernity results partly in political Darwinism, in which man was reduced to the role of representative of his species, and the role of the state was to create conditions to meet his needs. The state gave the biographical space to the individual. and this took over the form of an autonomous right to shape his own biography. In this way, typically a modern tension was created between the task of the state, which consisted in providing elementary needs, food, housing, security, and the freedom of the individual to shape its own biography in a free and unlimited manner. Once this struggle won the state, regulating the life of the individual in accordance with the requirements of knowledge and hygiene, other times the individual, forcing the state to recognize broad autonomy, including the right of unhygienic behavior and even behavior that is harmful from biological perspective. The effectiveness of the state's actions could be measured by the prolonging lifespan, the successes of increasing individual autonomy, the admission of stimulants, and the expanding right to behave without any constraint. Many critics have pointed out that the state, by its supervision, also interfered in the biography of citizens. In particular, the arguments formulated by Michel Foucault, critical of biopolitics, which in his understanding reached far a number of disciplinary techniques and in practice made it impossible to shape people's own biographies, were famous. But I'm not going to speak about Foucault, it's a wide field, so let the subject of the discussion the subject of the discussion is no longer the freedom to shape biography, but the freedom to interfere in physiology, not only individual but also in general. Biography has become the domain of the activity of the individual subject. It's a typical modernity way of perceiving it. Freedom to shape one's own biography is not called into the question. However, their interference in the shape of Zoe is more and more questionable. Biological science show that we all participate in Zoe. It may be described as a common good, and the protection of it has the deepest ecological character. So also I will defend the position that participation in Zoe exceeds the individual's freedom. As a common heritage, it must be, or let's say it should be, protected from abuse. That contemporary corollary is environmental protection. The ancient corollary was protecting the common good of the polis. We should not blur the boundary between the nature of which we are and element, which we are an element, and the biographical equipment we give ourselves to various degrees. And I will show the quote from Jürgen Habermas, because he also raised that argument, but in the context of equality, dignity, and autonomy. Jürgen Habermas says that a disturbing contemporary phenomenon is the blurring of the border between nature, of which we are an element, and the organic equipment we give ourselves. In his words, what is so unsettling is the fact that dividing line between the nature we are and organic equipment we give ourselves is being blurred. At the same time, Zoe means the entire ecosystem with its laws. If the Zoe is a global resource, we must ask, how should it be protected? There are a number of different possibilities, but one comes first into our mind. We already have state institutions, and they can protect our environment and wildlife. The human is also such animal. In this way, a clear border could be drawn between the man and his individual biography and the common, generally biological and general basis for the biography. We may ask the question about the right to unmanaged genetic heritage. And I will also quote Jürgen Habermas. The human species might soon be able to take its biological evolution into, let's look, maybe, no, sorry. So, here we have. The human species might soon be able to take its biological evolution into its own hands. Partner in evolution, or even playing God, are the metaphors of the auto-transformation of the species, which it seems will soon be within reach. Legal protection is indicated here also by Habermas, which could be, this protection could be expressed as right to genetic heritage and accessible to artificial interference. The argumentation presented above indicates that interference in the sphere of zoe, modification of the genetic code posed on, may have consequences that are currently difficult to predict. If we treat life as a common good, then we recognize that all interference in its essential content can also affect all other beings. A genetically modified human species may interact in a different way with other species around it. This argument limits the right to interfere in physiology where it is related to the impact on the shape of the species, whether changes occur permanently transferred to the next generation. Changes that transform an individual body are not subject to this type of argumentation. It does not prejudge the question of abortion, euthanasia, suicide, or any kind of technical support of the body. It's nothing with it. But a clear border is set whether the individual's action would affect the genetic endowment of future generation. It does not eliminate cases such as, for example, the one-child policy in China. There were risks to humanity there. Parents were allowed to have only one child there, and as a consequence of individual decisions made by parents who preferred to have a male descendants, there was a generational imbalance that will have lasting and yet unforeseen and unforeseeable consequences of not having enough girls and young women. However, that argument does not reach such cases, since they mostly involve biography and politics. That argument only indicates that the limit of permissible interference is a positive impact on a genotype of the future generation, and that is, it is very hard to know that one will do more good than harm. So, one conclusion of the ecological value of the human genetic inheritance is that it should be forbidden, or at least it should be carefully observed, to indirectly improve human species, such as experiments with animal-human hybrids, positive modeling of gene pool of the human species, but also altering other species genetically for our benefit, all might do. Jürgen Habermas points to the need to protect the biological basis of our personal identity. It gives the protection of right to genetic heritage free from artificial interference. And although it appeals to the value of dignity, its considerations also indicate the general ecological character. In conclusion, philosophers such Francis Fukuyama and Jürgen Habermas, referring to Enlightenment heritage, speak against posthumanists in terms of political philosophy. For political reasons, genetic modification that could be passed on the future generations should be carefully observed. Undesirable political consequences, such as threat to equality, dignity, and autonomy may be pointed out. There are also deep ecological risks associated with interference in the shape of the human genome because it may dangerously interact with the rest of the ecological system. My practical recommendation is to put the principle of the presumption of harm at the center of innovation in the human species. It is a principle that can be applied in a political way in relation to research on such delicate issues that can potentially disturb life understood as a shared good and a zoe that we all need. Thank you very much.
I am Mike, but am I also heard? Yes? Great. So Professor Nogal, if you'll join me here, we have gotten permission for 10 extra minutes, so we'll have about 15 minutes of discussion and 10 minutes of questions from the audience. So ending at 3:10. Now I've lost the page of my questions I made. Thank you for this. Would you like your water as well? Or?
I will take it, okay.
There's kind of a hypothetical imperative here. If you want liberal democracy, don't do transhumanism. Yeah? So if you like those values, don't push for innovation. But what if either we, or you, or trans or posthumanists don't much want liberal democracy? Is the ecological value the only one you see that could be appealed to? Because that doesn't rely on liberal democratic arguments. If you're a communist, or if you're, I don't know, if you're a Fourierist on your farm, you need ecology as well. You need Zoa. So, but do you see any other values that could be appealed to or could usefully be sought if we say we're not liberal democrats, like if we're in China or Russia or?
It's difficult because we are living in a political context where liberal democracy is starting and final point of our discussion. So we can imagine, of course, that we could live in a different environment, intellectual environment, but that argument, even if there are some people who not share not believe in those values as equality, dignity, or autonomy, we can show that posthumanism may and will change political system, may lead to political changes. And you don't need to be a liberal democrat to be a little bit afraid that political situation may be changed by those scientific and technological actions. So that's why I am looking carefully, like a from the perspective of political philosophy, at posthumanism, because it's not a neutral technology. That technology may affect our common life and may bring good consequences, but also, as was pointed out a few times before me, bad consequences. So we should look at it very carefully, even if we are not liberal democrats.
Okay. There was many appeals to the common good, and it's often enough in these conversations that the common good is appealed to, but that assumes there is something that's known to be common to us, so there's some sort of first-person plural, a we, and we have something in common, and it's also good. I assume that if we're looking at what Michał Waszewski talked about in terms of an umbrella term of transhumanism, that there's a denial that something like the Zoa is both indelibly common and that it's certainly not good, or at least not best. right? So it needs to be altered. So if it is good, it's not good enough. So is there a form of your argument that could pull your transhumanist who's sitting next to me, toward you to see this as both a common and a good, and more than just a way of self-interest, that we want the state to basically protect our lives so that we aren't subjected to harm, but common goods that pull at us and ask us, that would obligate us in some perfect or imperfect way, would seem to need to provide more than modern biopolitics does. It would need to do some more work politically for us than just saying, we're going to save you, so we're going to save your biography, we're going to make sure that you can, yeah. So do you have maybe a way to pull transhumanists toward you that this is a common good rather than just ecologically, but that the value extends further?
Each action in ecological spheres bring consequences in different fields, and it's difficult to even imagine those consequences. Of course, when I'm talking about it, I mean the future generation, maybe not our personal interest, but rather the interest of our future generation. But even now, you know, our belief in science and technology is not so vivid, and it's not so important because we realized some side effects of science and technology. So we can perceive side effects. We can look at them, and we have problems how to deal with them. And many of political discussions are concentrated of side effect of technological movements and technological changes. So maybe it is a little bit dangerous to put that type of action into human nature, even if you don't believe it, yeah, that there is something like human nature. It is a little bit because we already did it in the nature itself. We may believe it or not, but we see consequences, global warming and so on, so on, so on. So it is at least a little bit dangerous to put the same type of logic of action into the human nature, even if nothing like that exists, because then we may have such consequences, unpredictable consequences. So in my opinion, even for posthumanists, it should be an important argument that improvement should be somehow limited to the individual, yeah? You can improve yourself, but maybe not the whole species.
So if you choose to improve yourself, you're not allowed to reproduce or something of that sort. So are you? There is a bit of in Rumsfeldian epistemology, you know, Donald Rumsfeld about known knowns, unknown unknowns, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this known unknown. We know that there's an unknown harm that could come, and we hope for a benefit. However, I suspect as we move down the path of research and development, the known, we can know more about the potential harm. What I've heard from your presentation sounded to me more like a different suggestion, which was maybe it's better to do nothing and get on with something else. Would you suggest that it's a bogus way to spend human ingenuity to pursue something like this, or do you have a different understanding of what our collective approach might be when we decide to fund this or dedicate parts of the university to it or parts of our culture to it? I mean, think of how much money goes into just exploring this in science fiction, right? And multiply that by orders of magnitude in other areas of human life. So is it do nothing or something else?
You know, I am a philosopher, so Philosopher knows only arguments and notions, and I'm not an expert in practical issues. But what I would like to suggest is to look at bios in that binary form, that not we have life, yes? We have our biographies and we have our body, but liberal perspective that if we have it, we can produce whatever we want with it, maybe, in my opinion, dangerous. So it was the turn of John Locke, which put it, the relation between life and property on this way. And in my opinion, ecological consequences not only connected with the posthumanism, but also with ecology itself. We can show that consequences of that type of political culture, that type of mentality, that we can do with our ownership whatever we want, without looking at consequences and far-reaching consequences of our action. That way of thinking about our ownership, in my opinion, should be put into the question, at least, yes? That, you know, our action brings consequences to other people, which cannot be privatized. We cannot anymore use only the idea of ownership because we privatize our ownership, but consequences are important also for the other.
Well, I think culturally and legally there are very few types of ownership that are total.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, I can buy a Rembrandt in the Netherlands, but I can't put tobacco in it and smoke it legally, right? Mm-hmm. I have a sort of stewardship in it legally also. I can own it, I can pass it on. There's other forms of ownership or ownership in property of kinds that are partial, such as you can have usufruct or other things of that sort. There's a varying range. Do you have any useful borrowings from other areas where we could think about biography or our bios and zoa and usefully or analogically even think about how we own ourselves, or if we own ourselves, if we own life?
We have only metaphors, because we can speak about it from the religious perspective, and it's easy, yeah? Because then we will move backward to the classical formulation which was mentioned at the beginning. So it's easy to describe it from religious Christian perspective, but you know, it is difficult to define it and use legal metaphors, because we have different religions, and we have also different political systems and different legal tools, different types of ownership. The ownership here in Europe is generally a Roman type of ownership, Roman law, coming from the Roman law. But we have different cultures, legal cultures, like Chinese, for instance, and there are no such a type of ownership like we have. So maybe we should not concentrate on the type of ownership, because then we will move toward our notions connected to the ownership, but rather to a common practices, you know, internationally established practices, without using big metaphysical or even political words. Because if you will say the type of ownership connected to the Roman law, it may, be not perceived as something important for the other cultures.
And then I had a small question, and I'll ask Michał to change chairs with me, and we'll field some questions from the audience. And that is, a lot of the response to fears of technology involve legally forbidding things, which can be effective. But there's also cultural question, taboo, shame, ridicule, all of these other things that have caused us to dress ourselves in acceptable clothes in the morning and, generally keep ourselves in certain kinds of order that are not regulated in any society formally. But yeah, do you see any use for that as a way to steer, any of those to steer culturally transhumanism toward the good?
In my opinion, political culture is much more important than legal prohibitions, because in an international environment, you always can do something without taking legal circumstances into account by moving somewhere else. So political culture and a public debate and public norms is, in my opinion, is more important for that problem than legal prohibitions and so on.
Thank you. Do you want to swap with me, Emil? Thank you for that. Is there a microphone I could walk around with?
I'm interested in the way you developed your ecological approach to a critique of transhumanism. Theologians like Celia Dean Drummond have spoken about, in an alternative way, a shared creatureliness, which helps us with dealing with some of the problems around human distinctiveness. So I guess my question to you is, what does your liberal humanistic critique of transhumanism have to say, or what are the implications for animal rights and animal welfare?
Animal rights and animal welfare is a subject of many arguments directly connected to bioethics, rather. But generally, those ethicians bring, the idea of autonomy into an ecological sphere. So they try to perceive different entities as a source of equality or dignity because they can suffer and, so on. And in my opinion, not only those arguments are important, but also that deeper ecological argument which shows that we all participate in something, that we are the same ecological system. Without speaking about equality, even equality dignity, yeah? So I would like to look more, and in my opinion it is more even scientific perspective, less ethical, but more scientific, that all we have the same laws, that interaction in one part of ecological system brings consequences at the other spheres. So it's more scientific argument, less ethical one.
Is there another question? Yes, I see up here.
Hi, just a quick question. I liked how you brought in the idea of liberal democracy being threatened by this transhumanist and posthumanist development. My question to you would be, have you thought deeper about how families and communities which make up these liberal democracies will be changed? For example, if parents are choosing their child genetically, then their child is not necessarily naturally their child in any way. That relationship is now changed. You also mentioned state involvement in kind of these developments. how would those changes of the family and of small local communities, towns, cities, peoples, nations, eventually change the liberal state?
You know, it's not the subject of that presentation, and I should think more about it, because those consequences, I can't answer your question immediately. I do not know. We should somehow describe possible consequences and then divide them into positive and rather negative. For sure, there are such, you know, influence on future way of life of families and local societies, but you know, I was looking at that relation more from the perspective of political philosophy. So, sorry, but I cannot now answer your question more precisely.
So, I don't know which clock is correct. I have 2 extra minutes on mine. What's it? Yeah.
Well,
I on it, and then we'll have to end.
Well, as Chesterton said, family is the most anarchic of all institutions, and when I'm looking at society and family, there are different principles of unity, and family is based on the principle of love, and then you have different principles, like principles of law that were mentioned, or principles of transgression. And when family changes its principle from love to different principles, like transgression, because to my mind transhumanism is transgression, and then it's instrumentalizing, in that very respect, is instrumentalizing. I think about Jen, so I have to be careful with transhumanisms. But if transhumanism is about instrumentalizing also our kids, then we are introducing different principle within family, and that will be the principle of say, of interest. And then if family is lost, to my mind, then, you know, liberal democracy and the whole world is lost, because this is the most important institution that is the bulwark of our independence and the bulwark of that single principle, the most important one, of love.
Thank you to the speakers, and I believe now there's a coffee break of 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.